In 2014, archaeologists in Suffolk, England, uncovered 400,000-year-old fire-making technology that challenges either our understanding of Neanderthal capabilities or the entire timeline of human occupation in Britain. Now here's the part that gets interesting. This site was first discovered in the 1980s, but comprehensive publication didn't happen until December of 2025. That's 40 years between discovery and disclosure. Now, before we dig into what that means, let's address what's probably already bothering some of you. Those are AI images. Yeah, turns out I hate dealing with image copyrights and royalties, so here we are. You're disrespecting established archaeology. Well, only the kind that sits on evidence for 4 decades. Or, I disagree with your interpretation. Perfect. All of the sources are in the description or in the pinned comment, so show me where the evidence says anything otherwise. Welcome to Arnie's Brain Train. I'm Alex Arnold, and what they found at Barnham tells us something remarkable. Pyrite fire starters, heat-treated flint tools, and constructed hearths that represent cognitive sophistication that nobody attributes to that time period, which means someone 400,000 years ago had capabilities that we didn't think existed yet. So we've got 3 big questions to answer today. Were these Neanderthals who were far more advanced than we've understood? Were these an earlier human species with technology that predates our current models? Or, and this is the timeline breaker, are these species actually much older than we've discovered, forcing us to revise our entire evolutionary timeline? And on top of all that, why did it take 40 years for comprehensive publication? All of my sources are listed below, like I said. Let's get into it. So let's start with what we actually know. Between 2011 and 2014, archaeologists working at Barnham, about 80 miles northeast of London, conducted systematic excavations of a site dating to approximately 400,000 years ago, during the Hoxnean interglacial period. But before we get into what they found, here's the context you need. The British Museum first investigated this site back in the 1980s. The material has been collected, analyzed, and then sitting in museums now for decades. The comprehensive publication that details all this wasn't published until December of 2025, or last week for me. So keep that 40-year timeline in mind as we look at the evidence. The first piece of evidence? Pyrite fragments with repeated percussion marks. Now when you strike pyrite against flint, it creates sparks hot enough to ignite tinder. The concentration and condition of these fragments here indicate that this wasn't accidental. This was deliberate use for fire starting. So think about what kind of knowledge that this requires. You need to recognize that this specific mineral produces sparks when it's struck against another specific type of stone. That's not something that you stumble into randomly. That's systematic experimentation and knowledge that's been retained over time. The second piece of evidence, deliberately heat-treated flint tools. The analysis revealed controlled thermal alteration at temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius. When flint is heated to these specific temperatures and held there, it undergoes chemical changes. It becomes easier to shape, more predictable to work with, and produces sharper edges. And here's what's interesting. You can distinguish controlled heat treatment from accidental burning under microscopic analysis. Accidental burning creates irregular patterns and causes catastrophic fractures. Controlled treatment shows even distribution and systematic preparation. So someone 400,000 years ago understood material science well enough to improve their tools through controlled application of heat. The third piece of evidence, a defined hearth structure. We're not talking about scattered ash that could be explained by wildfire. This is a deliberately constructed fire pit with clear boundaries, contained deposits, and concentrated burnt materials. The soil chemistry around the hearth shows elevated phosphate levels from organic burning. The stones surrounding it show heat exposure on their interior faces, but not the exterior, which means that they were positioned to contain fire, not accidentally burned. This is architectural evidence of fire control. According to research published in the Proceedings of the Geologists Association and documented by the British Museum, this combination represents the oldest confirmed controlled fire use in Britain, and potentially among the earliest examples of sophisticated fire-making technology anywhere in Northern Europe. The evidence has been available in some form since the 1980s, but the comprehensive publication came in 2025. Why? Now, I keep mentioning that it's been 40 years from discovery to comprehensive publication. The real question is that normal? In theory, archaeological discovery should get published within a few years of excavation. Analysis takes time, peer review takes time, writing takes time. But 40 plus years? That starts to suggest something beyond just methodological caution. And here's something that I need to be honest with you about. I've known about this site for a little while. I've heard about it over the years. There have been finds and solid local publications about Barnham for years. But I had to wait until this major publication in December 2025 to make this video. You know why? Because if I had produced this content before the release of the major publication, YouTube would have flagged it as misinformation, and many of you would have just called me a liar. That's the system that we're working with. Honestly, it's pretty ridiculous. The system is designed to gatekeep credentials rather than push for truth that might challenge established narratives. To me, being pro-science should literally mean participating in the scientific process, which includes challenging assumptions and even challenging previous academic consensus. But instead, we have a system where you can't talk about documented archaeological evidence until the right people say that it's okay to talk about it. Now, defenders of this system will point to ongoing excavations, new analytical techniques, and the need for extensive peer review. And all of that is totally valid. But here's what's also true. There seems to be a pattern where findings that support the established timeline tend to move through peer review faster than the findings that complicate the narrative. Let me give you some examples of what I actually mean. Göbekli Tepe was identified back in the 1960s, but systematic excavation didn't begin until 1995. And when Klaus Schmidt started publishing findings about 11,000-year-old temples built by hunter-gatherers who hadn't even developed agriculture yet, the academic establishment pushed back hard for years. Then there's Lepenski Vir in Serbia, discovered in 1965, showing sophisticated settlement dating to 7000 BC. It took decades before mainstream archaeology really acknowledged what that meant for our understanding of European Mesolithic cultures. Or Karana 4 in Jordan, first excavated in the 1980s, showing large-scale hunter-gatherer sites at 20,000 years ago. This challenged the fundamental assumption that large populations required agriculture, but those initial findings just sat in limited publications for decades before we got comprehensive studies in the 2010s. Now, if you've been watching this channel, you know that I've covered all three of these sites before and some others. These sites literally rewrite how we understand civilization development, and they sat there for decades before anyone took them seriously enough to really dig into it. So, when we see Barnham showing pyrite fire starters, heat-treated tools, and constructed hearths from 400,000 years ago, and publication takes 40 years, we have to ask, was this just methodological analysis, or was this evidence that didn't fit comfortably into the established models? The pattern exists across multiple sites that have challenged conventional narratives for a long time. Alright, let's talk about why this evidence is creating such a real problem for established archaeology. To understand what I mean, we need to talk about who mainstream archaeology says was actually in Britain 400,000 years ago. Well, the standard narrative goes like this. Homo sapiens, that's us, anatomically modern humans, evolved approximately 300,000 years ago in Africa. The earliest fossils we have are from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, and the earliest confirmed Homo sapiens presence in Europe is only around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, with some contested evidence maybe pushing it back to 60,000 years. So when we're looking at 400,000-year-old sophisticated fire-making evidence in Britain, Homo sapiens is chronologically impossible. Our species literally didn't exist yet. That leaves us with Neanderthals, right? But here's the problem with that. Neanderthals are thought to have evolved around 400,000 to 350,000 years ago, which means that this Suffolk site is contemporaneous with their emergence as a distinct species. We're talking about the Neanderthals at the absolute beginning of their story, already using pyrite fire starters and heat-treating flint tools. Now, the standard model has characterized Neanderthals as being less cognitively capable than Homo sapiens. Even the more sympathetic modern interpretations still maintain some kind of hierarchy of capabilities. But the Barnham evidence shows something different. This sophisticated fire-making technology, using pyrite for ignition and controlled heat treatment of flint, this represents cognitive ability that equals anything that the early Homo sapiens achieved. Because think about it. There's no primitive way to discover that striking pyrite against flint creates sparks. There's no lucky accident that leads you to understanding that heating flint to a precise temperature improves how it works. These are things that require observation, experimentation, testing your ideas, and then passing that knowledge on to others. These are all markers of what we'd call modern cognition. Now, if you watched my video on lost cities that shouldn't exist, where we talked about things like Darankuyu's advanced ventilation systems and Ciudad Perdida's sophisticated water management, you'll recognize this pattern. Time and again, we find ancient capabilities that exceed what the textbooks say should be possible. So, we're left with multiple possibilities here, and all of them challenge our current models. Option A: these were Neanderthals right at the emergence of their species, and they possessed sophisticated technological capabilities from the start, which means that we need a complete revision of how we understand their cognitive abilities. Option B: these were an earlier species, most likely Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which means that this advanced fire technology predates Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years. And the story of migration into Britain is way more complex than our current model suggests. And option C, and here's the one that really shakes things up. What if Neanderthals or Homo sapiens are actually much older than we've discovered? What if our entire timeline for when these species emerged is wrong? This would mean that we're not just revising capabilities or migration patterns, but we're revising the fundamental evolutionary timeline itself. Either way, something major needs to be revised. So let's explore that first option. If Neanderthals created this fire-making technology at Barnham 400,000 years ago, then we really need to recalibrate how we understand their capabilities. Traditional depictions of Neanderthals have ranged from calling them primitive to, in more modern takes, saying that they were almost as capable as us. But the Barnum evidence suggests something quite different. These people possessed abstract thinking, systematic experimentation, and technological innovation right from their emergence as a distinct species. So think about what's actually involved in developing pyrite and flint fire starting from scratch. You need to identify which stones create sparks when you strike them together. You need to recognize that those specific sparks can ignite certain prepared materials. You experiment with different types of tinder to find out what actually catches fire the most easily. Then you develop the manual dexterity and precise technique to consistently produce fire on demand. Then you create a system for teaching this knowledge to others in your group. And finally, you maintain that knowledge across generations. Fire made this way isn't something that you stumble into by accident. This is deliberate technological innovation that requires planning multiple steps ahead. You have to be able to think, if I strike this rock against this other rock, and the sparks land on this prepared material, then fire will result. That's abstract causal reasoning. And the heat treatment adds another layer of complexity. Modern experimental archaeology has shown that controlled flint heating requires maintaining temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius for hours at a time. The temperature window is narrow, and the process is time consuming. So someone had to figure this out through trial and error. They had to notice that flint that had been near fire worked differently than fresh flint. They had to experiment with how close to the fire, and for how long, and at what temperature. They had to develop the ability to judge temperature without thermometers, and they had to determine that the improved properties were actually worth the time investment. That's not what we'd call primitive behavior. That's research and development. So, if Neanderthals possessed these capabilities 400,000 years ago, right at the beginning of their time as a species, then our assumptions about their cognitive development really need to change. We know that later Neanderthals created symbolic art, buried their dead, and what appears to be ritual made specialized tools for specific purposes. And they likely had sophisticated language as well. We know that they survived and actually thrived in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. If they had this kind of sophisticated fire technology from the start, suddenly their entire trajectory makes a lot more sense. There's a study in the Journal of Human Evolution that notes controlled fire use correlates with increased brain size, more complex social structure, expanded diet options through cooking, and the ability to occupy colder climates. All of these factors would push Neanderthal cognitive and cultural development much earlier than what our current model suggests. Now let's consider the second possibility. What if these weren't Neanderthals at all, but rather Homo heidelbergensis, a species that existed from about 700,000 to 300,000 years ago, and is thought to be the common ancestor of both Neanderthals in Europe and Homo sapiens in Africa? If Homo heidelbergensis possessed this kind of sophisticated fire-making technology 400,000 years ago in Britain, then both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens inherited this capability from a common ancestor, which means that the technological advancement we usually attribute to Homo sapiens wasn't unique to our species at all. It was part of an inheritance from an earlier species that got passed down through both evolutionary branches. This also has some pretty significant implications for how we understand human migration. The presence of Homo heidelbergensis in Britain 400,000 years ago, with this kind of advanced fire technology, would indicate that Northern Europe wasn't just barely accessible during interglacial periods. These populations weren't hanging out on the edge of survival. They were actually thriving, well enough to develop and maintain complex technologies. The site at Barnham shows repeated occupation over time. There's evidence of multiple fire use episodes in the same location. The concentration of works tools, the rebuilt harsh structures, the accumulation of material, all of this indicates that this was a location that people returned to regularly, possibly seasonally, over extended periods of time. That suggests territorial knowledge, planning, and successful adaptation to the British climate during the Hoxian interglacial period around 400,000 years ago. If Homo heidelbergensis could achieve all of this, then both of their descendant species, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, inherited not just the physical traits, but an entire technological and cultural toolkit. You know that behavioral modernity that archaeologists claim emerged around 50,000 years ago with Homo sapiens? Well, it may have actually existed in earlier forms, hundreds of thousands of years earlier than that. Now, with this publication not coming until December of 2025, here's the practical question that we need to ask. When do textbooks actually incorporate this information? And when do the teachers start teaching it? Here's how the typical timeline works. A major discovery gets published. It takes about 2 to 3 years for that publication to be cited enough in other papers to become established in the academic literature. Then it takes another 3 to 5 years for textbook authors to incorporate the new information into revised editions. And then it takes another 5 to 10 years for those textbooks to actually get adopted in classrooms, because schools don't replace textbooks every year. We all know that. So, we're looking at a minimum of 10 years, more realistically, 15 to 20 years from publication to widespread classroom implementation, which means that the students won't be learning about this sophisticated 400,000-year-old fire technology until potentially 2040 to 2045. But here's the thing. The site was discovered in the 1980s. Let's say the pyrite evidence was clear by 1990. If it had been published promptly in, say, 1992 or 1993, it could have been in textbooks by 2000 to 2005. Instead, students who graduated high school between 1995 and 2025 all learned a different narrative. And most of those students, they're never going to update their knowledge of human prehistory after they finish school. The vast majority will go through their entire lives believing the version that they were taught, even though the evidence contradicting it has been sitting in museums the entire time. Publication delay matters because every year of delay is another year of students learning information that doesn't match the available evidence. We've seen the same pattern with other discoveries. I've already mentioned it before, like Göbekli Tepe was identified in the 1960s. It was systematically excavated starting in 1995, but it didn't make it into most of the history books until the 2010s. That's 50 years from identification to the classroom implementation. Lepenski Vir, again, was discovered in 1965, showing the sophisticated Mesolithic European culture dating to 7000 BC, and it still isn't in most high school textbooks today. That's 60 years of lag time. Karana 4 was excavated in the 1980s and got comprehensive publication in the 2010s, but it's still not in most textbooks yet either. So the Barnham findings are published as of December 2025, but when will they actually be in textbooks? When will teachers know to teach them? And how many other discoveries are sitting in museum storage right now, waiting? So beyond the archaeological interest and the academic politics, why should you actually care about this? Because it's a perfect example of how new evidence gets suppressed when it threatens established careers and reputations. We're not just talking about updating a timeline. We're talking about entire academic careers built on theories that this evidence contradicts. Just think about it. If you've spent 30 years publishing papers arguing that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior, and then you've built your reputation on that work, and suddenly evidence emerges showing that they had sophisticated fire technology from day one, what do? Do you admit that you were wrong and watch your life's work crumble? Or do you slow walk the publication process and hope that you can retire before the paradigm shift happens? People hate new ideas, especially when those ideas challenge their worldview. But it's even worse in academia, where challenging the paradigm can literally end careers. Tenure committees don't reward people who overturn established consensus. They reward people who build incrementally on accepted theories. This is why discoveries like Barnham sit for 40 years. It's why Göbekli Tepe sat for 3 decades. It's why Lipinski-Vir took decades to acknowledge. When evidence challenges the narrative, the people who built their careers on that narrative have every incentive to delay, dismiss, or downplay it. And here's what makes it worse. The younger archaeologists who might want to publish this kind of evidence, they know that challenging the established professors means that they're risking their own futures and careers. No tenure, no grants, no positions. So they wait. They collect the evidence quietly. They hope that by the time it's published, the old guard has retired. This affects all of us because it means that the story we're taught isn't necessarily the story that the evidence supports. It's the story that protects the most careers and challenges the fewest powerful people. Every time we discover that our understanding was incomplete or just wrong, it should be celebrated as progress. That's how science is supposed to work. But instead, we get a system where evidence sits in storage for decades because admitting that we were wrong is too professionally dangerous. And here's the practical angle. If evidence this significant can sit unpublished for 40 years because it threatens established theories, what else hasn't been published yet? What other discoveries are sitting in museum storage because they're too problematic for someone's career? What other evidence contradicts what we're taught in school, but would require too many prominent archaeologists to admit that they were wrong? The story that we're presented with isn't always the story that evidence actually supports. It's often the story that's the safest for the people controlling the narrative. And that gap between the two, well, that's worth examining. So like I do in every video, let's bring everything together here at the end. The Suffolk discovery at Barnham gives us 3 clear pieces of evidence. Pyrite fire starters with repeated percussion marks, deliberately heat-treated flint showing controlled thermal alteration, and a constructed hearth with clear boundaries and evidence of repeated occupation. All of this dates to approximately 400,000 years ago during the Hoxnean interglacial period. The site was discovered in the 1980s, and excavations have been ongoing since then, with intensive work from 2011 to 2014. But comprehensive publication didn't come out until December 2025. That's over 40 years from the initial discovery to the full public disclosure. And as we've explored today, this evidence forces us to choose between 3 new possibilities. If these Neanderthals were Neanderthals, then our current understanding of their cognitive abilities from the very beginning of their existence as a species needs major revision. They were sophisticated technologists from day one, capable of complex problem solving, systematic experimentation, and cultural transmission of advanced knowledge. If these were Homo Heidelbergensis, then the technological sophistication that we usually associate with behavioral modernity in Homo sapiens actually predates our species by hundreds of thousands of years. Both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens inherited advanced fire-making capabilities, heat treatment technology, and the cognitive tools for innovation from a common ancestor. Or, and this is the big scary idea, what if Neanderthals or Homo sapiens are actually much older than we've discovered? What if the entire evolutionary timeline we've built is based on incomplete fossil evidence and these species emerged far earlier than our current models suggest? This would require revising not just capabilities or migration patterns, but the fundamental structure of human evolutionary history. Either way, something fundamental about our understanding of human prehistory needs to be revised. And that's the problem. Revision means admitting error. It means entire academic careers built on the old models become outdated. It means textbooks need to be rewritten. It means professors who spent decades teaching one timeline now have to shift gears to teach a different one. The evidence itself is clear. Pyrite doesn't strike itself against Flint. Flint doesn't heat treat itself to optimal temperatures. And Hearths don't construct themselves with defined boundaries and repeated use patterns. Someone 400,000 years ago in what's now England possessed the knowledge, the skill, the cognitive flexibility, and the cultural mechanisms to master fire in sophisticated ways. And this information has been sitting in museums and academic institutions for over 40 years before we got a comprehensive publication. We've seen similar patterns at some of the other sites that I mentioned and have done videos on. These are all discoveries that have challenged established narratives, but they seem to face delayed publication pretty consistently. Not because the evidence isn't solid, but because publishing it threatens too many established careers and reputations. So with the publication now in December of 2025, most students still won't learn about this in school until 2040 or later. An entire generation will graduate having learned different timelines, and most of them will never know that the information has been updated. That's why this channel exists, to present evidence that challenges the established narratives, not to provide comfortable answers that protect academic careers, but to show you evidence that deserves examination and to ask questions about why information takes so long to reach the public when powerful people have reasons to suppress it. That gap between what the evidence shows and what we're told it shows, that's not just about science. It's about power, careers, and who gets to control the narrative. That's always worth investigating. Well, everybody, thanks for joining me on this episode of Arnie's Brain Train. All of the sources that I referenced, like the British Museum documentation, the Journal of Human Evolution articles, and the December 2025 comprehensive study, all are going to be linked in the description or in the pinned comment below. I encourage you to check them all out for yourself. Look at the archaeological reports, examine the evidence, check the publication dates, and then draw your own conclusions. If you want to see me improve any aspect of my videos, if you've got topics that you want me to cover, if you know about other discoveries that have had these kinds of delayed publication timelines, or if you just appreciate evidence-based investigation, hit that subscribe button and help me grow this channel. Your support really does make these productions better, and it allows me to dive deeper into topics that mainstream education takes decades to incorporate. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think that the Barnham firemakers were Neanderthals with capabilities that we've seriously underestimated? Were they Homo Heidelbergensis, showing us that advanced technology is hundreds of thousands of years older than our current models suggest? Or do you think that either of these species is actually much older than we've discovered, requiring us to rewrite the fundamental evolutionary timeline? And finally, what's your take on that 40-year gap between discovery and publication? I read every comment, and your insights often spark ideas for future videos. I'm currently working on a video about connecting Göbekli Tepe, Seth's Pillars, the Armenian Church, and some fascinating other connections to ancient astronomical knowledge. So, if you're interested in more sites that challenge conventional timelines, definitely stay tuned for that. And finally, keep questioning, keep learning, always take a moment to examine why certain information takes decades to reach the public, and remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. All aboard, and I'll see you guys there. Bye.